Hello and welcome to our second English video. I hope you've all had a lovely half term and you're all keeping well. I was really impressed by some of the responses that we had to the poem that we looked at before half term, Hope is the Thing with Feathers. We had some lovely writing and response. You'd obviously clearly understood the poem and written some really thoughtful ideas down. And we also had some brilliant poems written in response to it, your own versions, which I and your other teachers really enjoyed reading. So well done with those, they were great. Today we're going to be looking at a new poem, but before we do that, we're also going to have a look at petal paragraph writing, which is, I know you've all done before, but it's something that's so important that we just keep practicing those key ingredients of writing an effective paragraph about a text. And we're just going to keep on working on that because it was something that came up out of your work last time as something that we just need to keep improving. Before we do that, it might just be helpful for me to remind you how all of this work that we've been doing on poetry fits within your overall English literature GCSE. Well, it can be found here in these final two sections of your English Literature Paper 2, which together work out as being worth about 40% of your overall mark for the GCSE. So the first part is on power and conflict poetry, where you'll be given one of the poems from the 15 that you've studied in your anthology, and you'll have to explore that poem, how a theme or an idea is presented in it, and compare it to another one that you've worked on beforehand. The second section is on unseen poetry. You'll be given one poem for the first section that you need to analyse and explore an idea in, and then for the second section you will need to compare the techniques that are used in the first poem to a second unseen poem. Now the Wilson approach that we've been using is particularly important for this first section here. But in many ways, the approach to looking at and breaking down a poem will also be important when you're looking at this section, comparison section at the end. In many ways, the way of kind of accessing, breaking down a poem will also be important when you're thinking about your power and conflict poetry too. And also, this approach towards petal paragraph writing, which we'll be looking at a little bit further today, is also consistently important throughout English literature, whichever text it is you're responding to. And in many ways, it also crosses over into English language. So the idea of writing a paragraph clearly and keeping the petal ingredients in mind that we're going to look at today will be important throughout your time in English. Okay, so a little reminder then of what we looked at last time. Can you pause the video now and either write down or just say to the screen what you think this acronym Wilson stands for? So well done to you if you got these as your answers. The W stands for what and for who. So what refers to what the poem's all about on the surface. Are there any events that take place? Is there a story, a narrative involved? Are there characters that are mentioned? So what's the poem about on the surface? Who refers to whose voice can we hear if we can pick out a speaker or a narrator in the poem? What does their voice sound like? What is their tone? I refers to the ideas of the poem. That is an exploration of the deeper themes or concepts that are explored in a poem. And a quick look at those will form a really effective way to introduce your piece of writing about a poem. The main body will be made up of looking at language and structure. So L stands for language, which is where you will make a series of petal paragraphs looking at the way that the writers used particularly interesting and creative language to try and communicate their ideas and themes. Structure looks at the way that a poem is organised, or the decisions that a poet has made in how they arrange their words within a line, or lines within a stanza, or stanzas within the poem as a whole, as a way again of presenting you with different ideas and themes. Opinion is not a separate section, but it was just a way of encouraging you when you're writing about the poem to consistently give a personal response, to think about how the poem affects you as a person, and to give your own ideas as you're writing. And the final bit, now plan, is just a reminder for you to, before you start writing, to put a plan together, to go through this process so that you're really clear in your head as to what you're going to write before you start. Okay, thinking a little bit further back now, can you stop and just see if you can remember what PETAL stands for? So either write it down or say it to the screen now. Okay, so hopefully that wasn't too tricky for you. What you should have got are that P stands for point. And that's a reminder for you to include in every paragraph that you write a really clear point so that you are making it really conspicuous and obvious that you are answering the question. E stands for evidence, and this is a reminder for you to include in every paragraph that you write a quotation from the text, so a direct reference as a way of helping your answer be really clear and precise. T stands for technique. So this is encouraging you to consistently think about the methods that the writer's using as a way of creating an impression on you. So it might mean naming the technique, if possible you can. It could be metaphor or simile or personification or alliteration or enjambment or assonance or caesura, whatever it might be. If you can't remember the fancy name for it, don't worry about it too much. It's more important that you always notice the technique that the writer's using, that sort of to say what you think the writer is doing. But if you can remember the name for it, it always makes your writing that much easier. A stands for analysis. And this is where you are thinking about how the technique that's being used in the quote that you've picked out creates an impression on the reader. So really analysing how the language or how the structure creates an impression on the reader. L stands for link, and normally when you're thinking about A Christmas Carol or Inspector Calls or Macbeth, this can mean a link to context. So you're thinking about the world that the writer is living in and what his bigger idea is. What is it that he wants to explore in his writing? When you're talking about poetry, obviously particularly unseen poetry, you're not going to be writing about that because you're looking at poems that you don't know anything about the context of the poet with regard to. So link here, and again also in other types of literature too, can be a link to somewhere else in the text. So a link to another quotation. So you might be looking at a contrast with an idea found in a particular part of the poem, or a similarity as well. So what would a PETAL paragraph answer look like? This is the question that you're going to be answering in the next lesson. How does Donne present isolation in the poem? So you'd want to start off with a point. Donne suggests that isolation is, and you'll see here that I'm using that word isolation, which is mentioned in the question. So I'm making a really clear point and showing the examiner that I'm answering the question that he's asked. This is shown when he says, and I'm going to give a quote to back up the point that I'm making. This is an example of, and here I'll name the technique that's being used. Either it could be a language technique, we talked about metaphor, simile, personification, those ones before, or it could simply be a word type. So mentioning the type of word that's been employed to create an effect. It creates the impression that, so talk about in our analysis of how that technique creates the impression on me that we mentioned in the points to begin with, and then how this is similar to or contrast to another point in the poem. Now you won't necessarily include a link to another part of the poem every paragraph, but it's important to keep that in your mind as you're going forward, so that when it is relevant to make a connection, that you'll do that. Now, one top tip that I do want to remind you of at this point in time is to refer to the poet by name. Obviously, in the question, it asks you, how does Donne present isolation in the poem? We know the poet is John Donne. We don't call him John because he's not our friend, but we call him Donne, and so that's the sort of formal way that you write about a writer when you're analysing their work. And it really helps because lots of students get tied up when they, particularly at the point where they have to compare two different poems. They start to say, the poet who wrote this poem says this, in contrast, the poet who says this in the second poem, which is called this. And in fact, if you just say their name, Donne says this, in contrast, Dickinson or whoever it might be says this, it just helps to clean up your answer and make it much easier to write about. But it's important to remember that a petal paragraph structure doesn't tell you what to write. So some people might worry that it's formulaic, you've got to write this and then this and then this and then this, and all your answers basically sound the same. Very far from it. Just like the Wilson approach, actually it's just about helping you to remember the ingredients that you need to include in your answer. So when you're in a particularly stressful or worrying situation like in an exam, you don't forget something that you really know you should include. So here's an example of a different sort of petal paragraph, one that starts with the technique, moves on to the evidence, you finally get to your point, you then link to another part of the poem, you analyse the effect that it has on you, and then you go back into it again. You include more evidence, a second technique, and then try and analyse a bit further, and so on and so on. It just helps you to remember to include those different elements so that you don't forget. So today's poem is by John Donne. Here he is with his rather inspirational lockdown beard. And he was a contemporary of Shakespeare's, although nobody's sure whether they ever actually met. He became really ill later in his life, and he was poorly for 23 days. And every one of those, nobody's really sure what he was ill with. I think some people think it was typhoid or something like that. But he was very, very ill. And every one of those days, he got a pen and paper and he wrote down his ideas on life and death and how to lead a good life. And when he became well again, he took those ideas and he put them into 23 separate short pieces of writing called his meditations. And the piece of writing that we're going to look at today is from the 17th meditation, which became a really very famous poem. So lots of lines from it have passed over into popular culture, particularly the first line, "No man is an island," which has sort of passed over into everyday speech. You've probably heard that said at some point. And then also the penultimate line, "For whom the bell tolls," has passed over into lots of different areas of popular culture, from an Ernest Hemingway novel to the Metallica and the Bee Gees. Ask your parents about those. But because it wasn't originally a poem today, we're not going to look at structure in our answer. So we're going to focus on the beginning part of our Wilson analysis. We're going to look at the what, the I for the ideas, and the L for language most of all. So here it is. I'd like you to have a go, first of all, at reading this through on your own. So if you can pause the computer now and just have a go at sounding it out in your own head and trying to get a sense of what it's all about. Okay, well done. Let's read that through then together. No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manner of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind. Therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Okay, before we go any further, it might just be helpful for some of you if we go through some of the language of the text that you might misunderstand or not be familiar with. Even though it's an updated version from the original text, it's still got some old language in there that might confuse some of you. So let's have a look. First of all, this word man here, it's mentioned a few times in the poem. It doesn't mean man as opposed to woman, it means man in the sense of mankind, so a person. No person is an island, entire of itself. The word entire means kind of complete, sort of independent. So no man is an island, no person is an island, complete of itself. Every person is a piece of the continent, a part of the main, as in mainland, part of the main continent. If a clod be washed away by the sea, clod here means a lump of earth. Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were. And promontory means kind of headland or part of the land that's jutting out into the water, into the sea. Manor means like a manor house. The word diminishes means reduces, makes less. And we've got these old words here, thy and thine, which mean your. So as well as if a manor, large house of your friends were washed away, or of your own house was washed away. And then you've also got this word here, I can't make my pen work on it, thee, which means you. So never send to know for whom the bell tolls, and the word tolls here means a ringing of a bell, like a church bell, but it's not any kind of ringing, not like a celebratory ringing after a wedding. It's a very slow, rhythmic ringing on the same tone, and it refers to the ringing of a bell to send a message, in this case, to tell you that somebody's died. So if we read it, for those people who might be confused by some of those words, no person is an island, complete of itself. Every person is a piece of the continent, a part of the mainland. If a lump of earth be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a headland were, or if a big house of your friends or of your own house was washed away. Any person's death reduces me, makes me smaller, because I'm involved in mankind. Therefore, never send to know for whom the bell rings in that slow, rhythmic way that sounds to tell us that somebody's died. It rings like that for you. Okay, so the next task that I'd like you to do, please, is, do you remember last time when I did my drawing of the bird, not very successfully? I'd like you to go through this then, and down the side, down here, if you've got the poem printed out, or if if you've just got a piece of paper, you can jot down some of these key images. I'd like you to write, do a little picture of each of the key images in the poem. So, no man is an island. I would have a desert island to start off with, and so forth. Okay, have a go at that then, please. Okay, so if you've had a go then at drawing down those little key images of what's going on in the text, the key pictures that the poet puts into your mind as you're going through, they should look something like this. You'll notice I haven't drawn mine this week to try and make it a bit easier for you. Here you've got the desert island. I think that's the first thing that's mentioned. No man is an island. Instead, every person is part of a continent. And the continent that he refers to, because he was British, lived in London, was Europe. And then I've got the clod of earth, I've got the promontory, I've got the manor, could be mine or it could be my friends. And then at the bottom, we've got the tolling bell. So you'll notice also that I've got breaks in between mine. I've lumped them together because I think that he does use a series of contrasts in the poem. So at the beginning he says, no man is an island, so no man is that. Instead, everybody is that, part of a continent. And then I've combined these three together as well, the clod of earth, the promontory, and the manor house. He says, it doesn't matter if a clod of earth is washed away, or whether it's a promontory, or whether it's a house, whether it's your friend's house or your own house. If part of Europe or part of a continent is washed away, then the continent is smaller. And then finally, I got the tolling bell. And it doesn't matter, he says, whether it's for somebody else or whether that tolling bell is for you. Okay, so bearing all of those ideas in mind and the kind of the understanding of the poem that hopefully you're starting to build up, I'd like you to have a go at looking at the first couple of stages of the Wilson analysis. This part would form your introduction once you've got it clear in your head. So the W with the I, the what and is going on in it, and the ideas. First of all, what's the poem about? Sort of on the surface. And what do you think are the main ideas and themes that the poet's exploring in the poem? If you're feeling confident, you can also go on to think about who is speaking and what's their voice like. Now, try not to include information about John Donne. I know I gave you some kind of contextual information just for a bit of background to start off with, but in the exam, you wouldn't have that information. So try and think about, from the poem, what kind of voice is speaking, what's the tone of the voice that's communicating these ideas to you. Okay, so now that you've got those key ideas down, and remembering those will form your introduction to your essay, I'd like you to start to move on to thinking about the L phase, the language part of your piece of writing, which will be the opening part of your the main body of your piece of writing, and the last part though that we're going to work on today. Can you pick out 3 ways that language is used to present the theme of isolation? So this relates to the question that we mentioned earlier on of how isolation is presented. Now, obviously, with this piece of work, it's talking about isolation and the opposite of isolation. So it's suggesting that people aren't isolated at all, and in fact, we're all related to each other. So when we're talking about isolation, you need to refer to both of those things. So how's language used to present that theme? In each of those instances, can you, for the second part, name the technique that is used in each case? Okay, remember, if you can't remember the name of the particular technique that's being used, try to describe how language is creating an effect. And then finally, how do these techniques create an effect on the reader? That's your analysis part. So if you've got all of those points there, you'll be in a great position to pull them together to write 3 really effective PETAL paragraphs on this text tomorrow. Right, well done then. So you've made it through to the end of the video. Hopefully, if you've been through all that step by step, you should have some quite clear ideas as to what the poem's about, and what the deeper message or ideas that the poet's trying to communicate to you. Obviously, you can go back and have a look at any of those sections again, go through it slowly, pick them apart if you need any extra help. But hopefully, you should be in a position where you're able to start writing about it in the next lesson. The question that you're going to be asked, as I mentioned before, is about isolation. But clearly, this poem is not just about isolation, it's about the opposite of isolation. So the fact that no man is an island, but instead part of a continent. And sometimes in the exam, you'll get asked about a particular theme, and what it's really talking about is that theme, but also the opposite of it. So don't be put off by that. You'll notice this week also that I've tried to give you slightly less in the way of support. We've gone through the poem together, but then I've kind of not given you what I would say about it. I'm trying to leave that to you, and I'm interested to see what you'll come up with. So tomorrow you're going to be writing a Wilson answer-ish, in the sense that you're going to be looking at the introduction with the W in the I. You're then going to try and make 3 PETAL paragraphs on language. Don't worry about structure unless there's something particularly interesting that you want to add to that. Do think about incorporating your own opinion, your own personal response into your answer, and hopefully we've kind of structured that enough for you that you don't need to do a plan. For your PETAL paragraphs, again, remember, if you can't think of a link from between one part of the poem to another, don't worry about that. Just think about your P, your E, your T, and your A, and that will be all that you need. So just use your notes from today. Lesson 3 then, later in the week, we'll be looking at some literature revision, so digging out those key texts that you've already studied, and trying to go over some character analysis from that will help you to keep those things fresh in your mind. And then towards the end of the week, you'll have your regular reading quiz where we get an extract that you'll be able to answer some questions on, and also the answers from the task that you did just before half term. So we've managed to be a little bit quicker today. I hope it's been useful for you. I hope you get some good work done this week. Do contact me or your teachers if you're stuck about anything that we've been through today, but I look forward to seeing what you've come up with. Okay, bye for now.